Like most people, I've encountered hundreds of bouts of anxiety in my life. Whether it was, getting nervous before going to class when I was in college, or if I was in the presence of somebody that, say, I was attracted to or that I was intimidated by because I felt like they could outdo me. And over the years, as I've uncovered that there are many things you can do to minimize anxiety, which is very necessary because if you can't do that, then it'll just throw you off your game and stress you out. The key word there is minimize, because there's always going to be some residual amount left. You're never truly going to be rid of anxiety in its entirety. So since we have talked about some ways to minimize it before, I want to first start off by recapping some of that and then address the question of how can we make the best of what we're left with so that it works to our advantage rather than being to our detriment. So first, to recap some of the ways we have talked about before of minimizing anxiety, one of the most powerful things you can do is match up whatever you're perceiving the reality to be that's causing you to be anxious with what the reality actually is. Because 9 times out of 10, we think that people are judging and scrutinizing our every move when the reality is that they're not. Because if you just took a second to look at those people and take a look at what's going on around you, you'd find that most people are either talking amongst themselves or playing on their phones, or they're sitting there really quietly and trying to take up the least amount of space possible and make the least amount of noise possible, because they're much more self-conscious about themselves and much more concerned with themselves than they are concerned with you. And so you're kind of getting worked up over nothing in that case. And if you want further proof of that, just put yourself in their position. So if most of the time you're much more concerned with yourself and very self-conscious about the impression that you're setting, odds are that most people are thinking the same way. Now, there's also no harm in preparing. So if ever there's a situation you're about to enter into and you think it's going to make you anxious for whatever reason, then there's no harm in picking it apart and identifying exactly what it is you're worried about and then mitigating those things ahead of time. So if you're going into class and you're worried about making it look like you haven't done the homework or the reading, then you can fix that by doing the homework or the reading beforehand. Or if it's a job interview and you're worried that you're going to come across as not understanding the role or the company very well, then you can fix that by studying that and preparing for those things ahead of time. And then you can have confidence in the actual moment that you have to perform, knowing that you've done your research and your homework, so you're going to be okay if you're ever called upon to actually meet those standards or to perform. Now, another thing you can do is give yourself the approval that you seek from others. So instead of looking at it as, I'm only going to look okay or sound okay if everybody in their crowd agrees that I do, instead think of it as, I look okay and sound okay because I say so. And if anybody wants to challenge that, you can kind of take on the attitude of being a little combative and saying, who appointed you the moral authority on what is okay and what isn't? My opinions are just as valid as yours. And the last item, at least for this list, is to accept what I said earlier about there always being a minimal level of anxiety there that you can't control. Because if you're not okay with that, then you're just going to end up fighting it and trying to solve yet another problem on top of everything else that you've got going on, which is just going to stress you out. And to top it all off, it's not a problem that can be solved. So instead of fixating on that and thinking about it so much, focus your resources on something else that you can control, and eventually it'll naturally subside. So now let's address the main question of how we can use that minimal level of anxiety to our advantage if we're never going to be able to get rid of it entirely. In other words, as they say, if you can't beat them, then join them, right? So there are many ways in which you can do that. The first of which is to harness the energy that's made available to you by your anxiety. Because whenever you're nervous, there's a bunch of adrenaline flowing through your system that you can use to empower yourself if the situation calls for it. So, for example, when we were in the Army, I remember we used to have to take the Army Physical Fitness Test, or the APFT, and we would all get very nervous before it because we had to do push-ups and sit-ups before we got to the ultimate test of character, as we all saw it, which was the 2-mile run. And not only did many people not want to fail it, but people like myself felt like we had a reputation to maintain of being fast runners. So there was a lot of hype behind it, and so I was very anxious and very nervous, like most people around me. But I learned that the fact that I was nervous was actually a good thing, because I could use that to power myself through the run and run faster, and it worked most of the time. Now, in a similar manner, sometimes anxiety pushes you to achieve higher standards than you would if you just didn't care. So in my case, for example, I choose to worry about my physical fitness, even though I could just as easily choose not to, because I know that it gives me an incentive to keep going back and to keep exercising. So I'll tell myself, although I do deserve a little bit of credit for today's workout or something like that, if I take too much time off, then I'm going to lose too much muscle, or I'm probably going to gain a little bit of weight. And that's what's kept me going back to the gym and staying in shape and exercising regularly for the last 15 years or so. But if nothing else, it's an indicator that there's actually something going on in your life and you have something to be captivated by, rather than there just being nothing to worry about, in which case things will become rather boring very quickly. So as another example, I recently was going to a social gathering where I was kind of nervous on my way there because I kind of had a history with some of the people that were going to be there. But then I realized, you know what, this is awesome because this shows me that I have something interesting going on in my life, because if I wasn't here right now, then I'd probably just be at home watching Netflix or doing something else boring, which isn't as noteworthy, and I'm probably not going to get a whole lot out of that. So to conclude, although you can minimize your anxiety, you're never going to be rid of it entirely. But that's not entirely a bad thing, because if you can harness that energy, use it to your advantage, and just learn to have fun with it, then that will work in your favor in a lot of different ways. And incidentally, that's going to make you a lot less anxious and more confident over time. So I hope this helps. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time.